Welcome, everyone. We're so pleased to have you join us today, and I trust that some of the topics that we talk about will be helpful for you in your different roles in caring for kids from difficult situations, difficult pasts. It would be really interesting to us if you could throw into the chat right now, if you could throw in your locations. We'd love to know where people are joining us from. As we do these webinars, we're going to be recording these for future use. But none of your, as a participant, none of your personal information will be recorded as part of that. I wanted to let you know how just the format for today. This is similar to what we've done before, where I will be showing a PowerPoint and I'll be giving you some information, talking about some important ideas about how we can help the children that we're caring for in your different settings and situations. And then we'll stop for Q&A. Now, when we do that, what we'd like you to do is, if we absolutely want to hear your questions, please put them into the Q&A tab. If you look at the bottom of your screen, you'll see a Q&A tab. Please put questions into that. And behind the scenes today, we've got Nicole and Renee from our clinical team. They're going to be looking through the questions. There may be some that they just answer right away on their own. There may be other questions that they think will be appropriate for the whole group, and so they'll highlight those for me. And then when we stop, we'll have those questions to review and talk through together. As you do that, as you share information in the Q&A, please don't use any confidential information about a child that you care for. So even if it's your own biological child, please don't use their name. But some other information would be helpful if you want to include something about their age and gender, that kind of thing, where they live, what your role is. That would be helpful for us in terms of answering the question for you. At the end of the webinar today, we'll be offering a discount for you in our thanks and appreciation for your webinars. And we're excited to offer a discount to our courses. We've got a number of courses online that we think will be give you a deeper dive into some of this material and really give you some practical strategies to be helpful with the kids that you care for in the different settings. So yeah, hang on till the end and we'll have that discount available for you. So again, welcome. I'm Dr. Chuck Geddes. I'm a registered psychologist here in the province of British Columbia. I live in Chilliwack, BC. This is on the traditional lands of the Stolo people, or people of the river, and I want to acknowledge that as we start. I'm going to share my screen with you because I want to just talk about our Complex Trauma Resources team. And we have, so Complex Trauma Resources is an organization that I founded approximately 10 years ago now. And we have an excellent clinical team that have been working with kids from complex trauma backgrounds. We've served well over 300 children and youth across the province of British Columbia, most of them coming from foster care. Most of them are in foster care, many adopted from foster care or even internationally, and other families that are just struggling with kids with complex challenges. And so here's some of the folks from our clinical team. I mentioned Nicole and Renee. They're behind the scenes today and helping with this webinar. So the topic today, we're going to be talking about how to build emotional regulation. So that's the topic for today. And I want to just give a bit of review. So one of the things, the concepts that we use regularly and that we talked about on the last webinar with you is this idea of how the brain is organized and in terms of the behavior and the things that we see on the outside. And so just roughly, you might think about your brain as sitting in your head, kind of like the triangle on the left-hand side. So most of us are kind of sort of a mature brain, an older brain. We're looking to have the brain be organized like this on the left, where the logical part of the brain, which is represented by the biggest part of this in this diagram, this is your cortex, your thinking part of your brain. And this part's kind of in charge, we hope, as we go through the day. It's helping us to take in information. It's kind of like the air traffic control center of the brain. And that's a term that the Harvard Center for the Developing Child uses. So the air traffic control is kind of in charge and helps us to manage the sensations and the experiences and the feelings and the relationships and the other demands of different situations. The emotional relational part of the brain is absolutely kind of engaged and working, but the survival part of the brain, for most of us as we go through the day, ought to be kind of a little bit offline, just kind of dormant, ready to jump into action if it needs to. The survival part of the brain includes the regulating systems that keep your heart going, that keep your lungs going, that kind of moderate the chemicals in your body. But the survival part of the brain also jumps into action when we're under threat, when we need to respond. This is our autonomic nervous system, and the survival part of the brain can jump in and get us ready to respond and react, to move to that fight or flight place. There's a number of different things that go along with that automatic or autonomic nervous system response. So that rarely comes up, but it can come up and then gets us ready for action, whatever we need to do to stay safe in that situation. We were contrasting that with the brains of kids who have lived through complex trauma or toxic stress, or where they've lived in situations that have been persistently unsafe and where they're never quite sure what's coming next. So that might be things like physical abuse, it might be emotional abuse, but it can also be things like never knowing when a parent's going to be available to you or not, never knowing whether you're going to have food or not, where you just don't know whether your basic needs are going to be met. And so as children are born, as we're all born, our brains are more organized like the brain on the right-hand side. And over time, we grow until we've got that kind of upside down triangle. I like that term, upside down triangle. Dr. Bruce Perry has used that term, and we've kind of borrowed it here. But I think one of the things that happens is that often kids from a traumatic background, their brains never really move from that immature brain to that mature brain. So their brains are more like the brain on the right-hand side. And the part of their brain that's actually guiding them through the day and kind of driving their responses and reactions, it's actually that survival part of the brain. The emotional and relational brain is definitely engaged, and they're having different emotional responses, and they're having kind of relational responses. It's the limbic, attaches roughly to the limbic system in the brain. But the logical part of the brain, that thinking part of the brain, that prefrontal cortex, that sort of manager, that air traffic control, is often not well developed and not even online for many of our children. So it's such a key concept. So we talked about last time that it's so important for us to understand and to respond to the idea that the survival brain and that fight or flight reaction is kicking in over and over and over for many of our children throughout the day. And that if we don't address that, if we don't quiet that stress response system, if we don't quiet down that autonomic nervous system, that threat detector in the child's brain, that we actually don't get to a place where the logical part of the brain is in charge. So we'll come back to this concept, but that it's such a crucial idea that many of the kids that you care for, who've come from traumatic experiences from hard places, are poised, their brain is poised to scan the environment, watch for danger, watch for threat, and then ready to take them quickly up into a place of fight or flight, a very protective kind of way of sort of going through the day. And so those threat detectors are on high alert, and often the big behaviors, the big emotions that we see are coming from that spot. They're coming from that place of dysregulation at a physiological level. So the last time that we spoke, we talked about, or in the last webinar, we talked about the strategies that we use to quiet down that overreactive stress response, that part of the brain, that physiological response. What do we do to quiet that down? So just, so with that in mind, so I want to talk about medications, and then we'll move on to talking about emotions. So today we're sort of moving from a review around this quieting the stress response in the survival brain, which is sort of job one. We'll talk about then how medications get used with many of the kids that we work with, and how that may help or actually hinder the things that we're trying to do in terms of quieting that survival brain. And then we'll move on to talking about the emotional brain and how we help with those emotional responses that can be so big. So as I talk about medications, I want to emphasize I'm a psychologist. I'm not a medical doctor. I'm sharing with you what I've observed over many, many cases and what the research literature says around medications for kids with trauma, and a lot too about what Dr. Bruce Perry and the Child Trauma Academy and the psychiatrists that are connected with his work, the way that they approach medications, okay? So if we, so let's sort of keep that in mind as we talk about medications. So one of the things that we see is with kids that are highly dysregulated in their behavior, one of the first things that happens is that when they are taken to see a doctor, they often receive a diagnosis of ADHD. So their behavior, because it looks impulsive, because it's kind of they're not very attentive, they're distractible, they're impulsive, they get into lots of big behavioral challenges. They're often diagnosed with ADHD. And so what do the doctors do? Well, they often prescribe a stimulant medication. So the stimulant medications, and these are things like Ritalin or Concerta. Concerta is the form of a long-acting form of Ritalin. Vyvanse, Adderall, Dexedrine, these are some common medications that are stimulants. So the idea is that they're actually trying to wake up that logical part of the brain. They're stimulating the prefrontal cortex, and in particular prefrontal cortex, in order to sort of wake that air traffic control up. So the idea is the reason we're seeing the behavior is that the logical part of the brain is not sort of stimulated enough. And so the medications are trying to deal with that, the stimulant medications. A big challenge with the stimulant medications is that they can actually end up stimulating that whole system. So again, thinking about the way that the brain's organized here, the stimulant medications sort of can flood the whole system with these stimulants. So the survival part of the brain is getting stimulated, more activated. The emotional part of the brain is getting more activated. And there may be some benefits in terms of the thinking part of the brain, sort of slowing down, able to concentrate on certain things. But it's often overridden by the effects of the stimulants on this entire physiology. So it's almost like giving the kids a stimulant can be like giving them a shot of caffeine, giving them an espresso first thing in the morning, and then we wonder why we're having these sort of big behaviors that are coming out of them. So there's a different way that we can approach this problem. If we see that the regulation, that physiological regulation, is actually the main issue, then we can look to medications such as clonidine or Intuniv. Intuniv is like a longer acting form of clonidine, or prazosin. So these are actually hypertension medications. So what they do is they slow down your heart rate, they slow down your breathing, they relax your blood vessels, and they're quieting your physiology. Can you see why Dr. Perry's group would recommend that these are the first line medications for kids with trauma, when it's that survival part of the brain at the base of the triangle that is so sort of hyperaroused and overactive. So these medications quiet that response down. So instead of going the direction of stimulants, it's often much more effective to go to these hypertensive medications, or clonidine, Intuniv, and prazosin. Prazosin, so clonidine is probably the most common that you would see with kids that you're caring for. Intuniv is gaining in popularity. I think that clonidine is something that often general physicians and or pediatricians, you'll see them prescribing Intuniv. Sometimes they feel like it takes a psychiatrist to prescribe that. Prazosin is a medication that's been marketed for PTSD. And so this is typically adults who've had sort of one focal trauma or a series of focal traumas and are using prazosin. But it's really interesting to me that actually what all that does is quiet down that physiological response so that they're not having as much of the intrusive thinking and intrusive feelings about those particular events that they've experienced. An interesting thing at the moment is that Intuniv is actually being marketed as an ADHD medication. Now, this helps us in one way, and that is that when your average physician and pediatrician thinks that the problem is ADHD, so it looks like ADHD, then they, the way physicians think is they think about what's on my drop-down menu. Now, what are the medications that are listed as being available to me to treat this ADHD? And Intuniv makes the list. So it's relatively easy to talk a physician into trying Intuniv instead of one of the stimulants because it's on the list. Clonidine's not and prazosin's not. Prazosin you won't see prescribed for children as often as the other two. Children or teens. So what's interesting about it is I don't think it's actually an ADHD medication. I actually think it's a calm the stress response medication, but it has these effects on what look like ADHD symptoms or parallel to ADHD symptoms. Okay, so what happens when we get it wrong? So when we get the medication wrong and we've got a stimulant medication, oftentimes what we see is you'll see a child who's got both a stimulant medication and clonidine often. Why is that? Well, it's because the stimulant medications have been increased over time because the child's not coping well, and then they're not sleeping. And so then they end up adding clonidine to try and quiet them down enough at night to sleep. And so sometimes you're seeing both of these, and it's almost like having a foot on the gas and a foot on the brake at the same time. The clonidine is used to try and help them to sleep, but really what we've done is we've kind of amped up their stress response system throughout the day. Now, when that doesn't work, so this is the progression I see and have seen over and over. We think it's ADHD, and so we treat it as if it's ADHD. We try the stimulant medications, things get worse. What do? We increase the dosage. You think that's going to help? Often not. Often it makes things even worse. And then we start to add in other medications to cope with the problems that we now have. So then we add in clonidine. Then that's not enough. So then we get into adding in antipsychotics. So this is where we're using antipsychotics as a type of sedative to control explosive behavior and big behavior, big emotions. Now there's some real dangers and cautions around antipsychotics, okay? First off, there's very, very, very limited evidence on the long-term effects on a child's brain of introducing antipsychotic medications when they're young. So we're trying to control the behavior, but we're adding in things that change the dopamine, change the serotonin, change the neurotransmitters and the way that they're operating within the child's brain. And the child's brain, which is trying to figure all this out, all of a sudden doesn't need to figure that out because we're pumping in either extra or less dopamine and serotonin. We're interfering with that process. So there's no evidence of what that does long-term in terms of the developing brain. Also, these medications, understand these medications are only approved, this is in Canada, they're only approved for age 16 or over for bipolar disorder or schizophrenia. There's some exceptions being made these days now for younger children who have autism spectrum disorder, but there's still no evidence for what these medications do long-term to the child's brain. So when they're used off-label, in a sense, which is more permitted in Canada, it's less permitted in the States. So often there are unintended consequences around using antipsychotics for kids. So we have massive weight gain, we have tics, we have just the over effects of sedation, not being able to think clearly, slows down sort of language and memory and some other things like that. And these consequences, particularly the weight gain and a tendency to take kids towards diabetes, is worse for Aboriginal kids. So we want to be super, super cautious before we do things. And when we talk about weight gain, we're talking about 20 pounds a year of extra. The kids end up with sort of an insatiable appetite, and they're kind of craving carbs all the time, and their weight can be going up 3, 4, 5 pounds a month, just boom, 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 until they're hugely overweight. All kinds of social consequences for that, right? So all of a sudden they can't be active, which we know would help with creating endorphins. They can't be successful in different activities and to the degree that they could be before. And there's rejection that starts to come with peers, and there's self-esteem issues. So all kinds of negatives around antipsychotics. In the US, it's illegal for psychiatrists to prescribe more than one antipsychotic medication at a time. And that's only allowed when there's a transition happening, when we're sort of titrating one off and adding in another one. So there's the only times that that's okay. So with antipsychotic medications, these would be things like risperidone, Seroquel, Abilify. These are some of the main ones that we see used with kids. Okay, a little bit more on medications, then we'll take some questions. So there's also SSRIs, selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, SSRIs. They're designed to treat anxiety and depression, so help with mood. So you can see why our kids with big emotions, big behaviors and big emotions, or even the internalizing kids that go inside and they're anxious and depressed and don't have any energy, can see why they would sometimes get prescribed with SSRIs. These are slow to build up in the system. It's interesting, if you think about the stimulant medications and the clonidine and Intuniv, the body responds very quickly to those types of medications. The antipsychotics tend to be a little quicker, but the SSRIs are slow buildup, so you don't even see effects often for 6 weeks or something like that. Some of the names that you'd see around Celexa or citalopram is the other name for that, Paxil, Prozac, fluoxetine, trazodone. Each of these is a little bit better at one of those anxiety or depression than the other one, so there's some variation in how they're prescribed. And one of the things that's interesting is they can actually have some pretty idiosyncratic, meaning personal negative reactions to it. So there's certain of these medications, so it can be quite a bit of trial and error that has to happen because individuals can have quite strong negative reactions to the different medications. Not always, but certainly that can happen. So for instance, I've got a little girl that we're working with now. She was put on some fluoxetine. So this is the idea was it's going to decrease that anxiety that they could see in her. She was on stimulant medications. They added in an antipsychotic, and then they added fluoxetine. When they added fluoxetine, her behavior got really, really out of control. She got a lot more aggressive. And so it wasn't at the first dosage level, but as soon as they moved to the second one, much more irritable, much more prone to aggression quickly in response to that fluoxetine. So that's the types of the reactions that we can see. There's sort of a, and it's, yeah, we just want to be really careful to watch for these with kids. In my experience, these medications typically are not that helpful with our kids who've been through complex trauma. I don't tend to see any real responses, positive or negative. I just don't think they particularly help because I think it's aiming at the wrong thing. And I think that quieting down that stress response is actually going to be the way that we want to go with this. Okay, so let's stop there for a moment and we'll just take a look at a couple of Q's and A's. I'm sure this is kind of getting lots of questions going. Okay, so got one question about a psychiatrist mentioning beta blockers. So in my understanding is that beta blockers, that's part of what these antitensive or hypertensive medications are. And so you might hear that term, but don't quote me on that because they might be referring to something different. So here's a good question. So interesting question. To what degree can we expect development and growth in the logical brain as the survival and emotional brain begins to calm? My son is 17 and has grown so much in the past 4 years since we adopted him, beginning to identify and express emotions, so not shutting down as he had before, beginning to attach securely, cognitively moving from around age 8 and cognitive testing up to age 13. I want to have reasonable goals and expectations. Really, really good question. Okay, so our experience with that, I would say, is that if you're familiar with our model, we talk about 7 developmental domains. And what we've seen over and over is when we can calm that stress response and we can deepen attachment, and with attachment goes that sense of felt safety in the world, that we start to see growth and development across all these 7 domains. And that includes the cognitive part, that includes the logical part of the brain. So if we think about the way that our brains develop through use. It's use dependent. So if I'm in a situation that's stimulating, that's a lot of information, new things coming towards me, and I'm in a calm place, then my brain embraces those challenges and learns, and the logical part of the brain, the language part of the brain, the memory part of the brain are firing and and increasing capacity in that area. When kids are living in stress and they're too stressed, that toxic stress over time, what's their brain concentrating on? Their brain's concentrating on survival. So those connections, those neurological connections that would grow in our brain around language, memory, problem solving, all of those kinds of things, they don't even get there because the emphasis is on over and over trying to stay safe, stay safe, stay safe, read the cues, stay safe. And so, so we can end up with that kind of development that we heard about in that question. So a child's development was sort of held back, delayed across all these different areas because of that massive amount of stress. That's wonderful to hear that this woman saying with her adopted son that as they provided that calm, as they provided that sense of felt safety, that gradually they started to see these other abilities come online. So we started to see growth and change in these things. So I've got another situation I'm involved with right now where, well, actually I can think of three or four different cases right at the moment where kids around the age of 5 or 6 years old were mostly nonverbal at the time when they were put into foster care, and even staying in foster care for a while without sort of proper interventions, they were staying nonverbal. So just too stressed to be able to develop those neural pathways and those skills. And so what happened is we had to work really hard at quieting that stress response, taking away things that were causing these children to be so stressed and overwhelmed, take those stresses away, deepen the attachment, provide that regulating, predictable kind of environment over and over and over, day after day. And what do you know? We start to see language coming online. When Dr. Mum I was just speaking with last week talked about how her kids at age 5, about 8 months ago when COVID kind of hit us, or a little bit longer than that, I guess. But when their world was restricted by COVID, they weren't trying to go to school, weren't going out to therapeutic programs. They just stayed at home and they had all this one-on-one time with her. And their language is just increasing leaps and bounds. And it's actually, it took a couple months for that shift to happen, but then it started to take off. Now, so I'm super excited about and optimistic about growth and change that can happen when we take care of those, that survival brain, when we learn to manage emotions better and accept healing relationships better. At the same time, there would be some limits, and this question was asking about that. Is there an upper limit to where kids will be able to reach cognitively if they've had all those years of deprivation? And the answer is we don't know. There's certainly some possibility that that restricted environment, that stimulation that they didn't get when they needed it, that's actually has affected their ability to take on that skill later. So there's definitely a possibility that there would be some cap on that. Plus, we do have to think about the genetic side of it too, in terms of how much gas do you have in the tank? What's your brain capable of based on your your genetic history, what you've inherited from your parents. So that could be a limitation as well, a little bit. But my tendency is always to kind of lean towards the idea that the brain is plastic, that neuroplasticity thing that says, wow, the brain, if there's any time in life when a brain can take off and learn new skills and learn new abilities, it's going to be during childhood particularly, and then teenage years. Once we get past teenage years, we definitely see this slowing down. So very interesting question. Let me just see if there's anything else that we want to respond to as far as question. Yeah, an interesting question here. Well, what are some signs that we should look out for if the medications are not working? So I think one of the things what we ought to see if we've got the right medications is that children are able to be calmer and able to sort of have that delay before they're reacting. And if medications aren't taking us to that place, if we're not seeing that they're calmer and there's a little bit more room for them to seek your help or to choose a calming strategy, this is assuming we're doing some other good things in their life. But if we're not seeing those changes in the medication, then they're probably not being that helpful. You can ask the kids how they feel. I'm thinking about the sedative effects. A lot of kids don't like that feeling of being sluggish, of being tired. So they feel like they're sort of fighting it through the day, particularly with the antipsychotics. So in terms of like medications not working, any tendency to add a medication probably means, or to increase the, so we need to increase dosages to get to a place where we're in the therapeutic range. So I understand that. But at this point, if we're trying a stimulant and that doesn't work, we increase it, that doesn't work, and we then take them off that and try a different stimulant. Once we get into switching these medications around, then I think we're really in trouble and probably not understanding the core issue well enough that we keep trying these different things. The stimulants are the sort of number one, I wouldn't say they're my number one worry, because the antipsychotics are a huge worry, because we just don't know where that's taking us down the road with in terms of the child's neurological development. But those stimulant medications often are getting in the way of seeing kids start to move forward. And so when I join a case and I hear about stimulants, I'm always curious whether those are actually helping or hurting, and whether the tendency is to just keep adding more medications on top of that. That would certainly be an indication that we've got the wrong things going on. Okay, there's probably a million things we could talk about around medications. So let's move on. So we're wanting to talk. So we're trying to shift from talking about medications to quiet that stress response system. Now we want to talk about the sort of physiological side of this. So one of the images that we love is this idea of a stress staircase, and understanding that oftentimes our children, the children that you care for, are running really high up this stress staircase as their baseline. And from there, it doesn't take them very long to get to a point where they're flooded, they're overwhelmed, it's too much stimulation, too much intensity, too much emotion, too much whatever, and they're flooded with that, and then they move to this fight and flight or freeze place where they just shut down. And so one of our key jobs is to try and help them to move down that stress response staircase so their baseline is lower. And the last time we met, we talked about 3 approaches that I take to that. So you can look at our first webinar if you missed that. But that I think about coming at this in 3 different ways: the situation and environment, the outside in, what can we do kind of outside in to decrease stress that this child's under. That's going to help us move down the stress staircase. Lots of different strategies connected with that. Bottom up, sensory activities, sensory-based activities particularly, but bottom up meaning things that we do actively with the child or teen to quiet their stress response system. And we want to be doing that in a planned and preventive kind of way, not waiting until they're dysregulated and then trying to use some sensory calming, mindfulness things at that point, because we're too late. So what we want to be doing is to do these on a planned, preventive kind of way to keep resetting them down that stress staircase as the day goes on. And overall, we're hoping that we actually reset their baseline down that stress staircase. If we can be lower on the stress staircase, we've got more time to think before we react. We've got more time to access other resources, help from a person, a caregiver before we react. There's lots of different benefits to us to being lower down. The last thing we talk about is sort of top down. So outside in, bottom up, and top down meaning the active teaching of self-calming. And this is on a physiological level. How do we help our body simply to be quieter and calmer and not as reactive? Okay, so we're going to move from that physiological piece now to think about emotions. So it's tough to separate these out, but we try and separate them out somehow. And so we're coming at the problem from the fighting stress side and decreasing stress response. And now we're going to add in the idea of attachment and also emotion regulation. So when we think about building emotional resilience, emotional regulation, one thing we would focus on is the holding environment. So that whole attachment piece. How can we help the child to feel, to increase that sense of felt safety, the holding environment, that there are adults around them they know that care for them, that are communicating in that in a way that the child can receive, and that are helping to structure the child's day in a way that they can be successful. So that whole idea of the holding environment, whether that's a school, in a home, that the adults are safe and connected, and the child can have that trust that the adults are going to care for them. We'll talk about that a whole lot more in upcoming webinars related to attachment and sort of creating that holding environment. So I'm not going to spend as much time about that today. But I want to talk about empathy and validation and the importance of that, and then building emotional language skills. So giving the kids some language for what they're experiencing, and then to practice that sort of emotional calming skills on their own. One group that we really like is the Emotion-Focused Family Therapy org. So they have 5 steps for emotion coaching that they train caregivers in. We really like this sequence. And we feel that this gives our caregivers sort of a way to sort of think through and sort of point by point. Did I do this? Did I do this? Did I do this? And there's a sequence to this, right? So the way that this was originally laid out by Emotion-Focused Family Therapy talked about attending to the emotion. So you're paying attention to it. You're aware of a child feeling something, even if they haven't sort of stated it. And you're then looking to help them put a name to that. And sometimes that's just coming from a curious place. Oh, wow, it looks like I can see your face is kind of down. I wonder if you might be feeling this. So we add in that idea of curiosity about it. And we're offering language for a feeling because many times our kids can't identify that. So they don't have much vocabulary for what they're feeling. So we're trying to offer some words. Oh, I wonder if you're feeling disappointed because of this. I wonder if you're feeling left out. I wonder if you're feeling discouraged. I wonder if you're feeling sad because of. And it's curious, we're concerned, and we're interested, and we're offering out some simple things. The response of the kids might be, no, I'm not. Your oppositional kids, no, I'm not feeling that. But you're sort of planting the seeds and maybe coming back to it later. So that naming it, helping them to put it into words, and then the crucial step of validating the emotion. So allowing the child to see that you understand, and that you understand why they might be feeling like that, and that emotion is okay. So whatever they're feeling is okay. It's only much, much later that we're going to try and sort of meet their emotional need and then fix it. So much later, we've got to get the validation step down. In fact, the emotion focused family therapy group, I think, has actually shortened this and really highlighting validation being the most important part of this whole step. So validating, I understand, oh, that must feel, we're expressing empathy, that, oh, I can understand how that would feel really bad to you. And when we provide that empathy, what it does is you think about Kim Hetherington, I don't know if you're on the call, one of our colleagues, she talks about that kind of pressure cooker that's building up, right? That emotion that's building up and building up. And when we hear the emotion, when we reflect it back, when we validate it, it's like letting some of the air out of that balloon or out of that pressure cooker. So let's just go a little bit more with the empathy and why that's so important. Sorry about that.
So what is empathy, and why is it very different than sympathy? Empathy fuels connection. Sympathy drives disconnection. Empathy, it's very interesting. Teresa Wiseman is a nursing scholar who studied professions, very diverse professions where empathy is relevant, and came up with 4 qualities of empathy. Perspective taking, the ability to take the perspective of another person or recognize their perspective as their truth. Staying out of judgment, not easy when you enjoy it as much as most of us do. Recognizing emotion in other people and then communicating that. Empathy is feeling with people. And to me, I always think of empathy as this kind of sacred space when someone's kind of in a deep hole and they shout out from the bottom and they say, I'm stuck, it's dark, I'm overwhelmed. And then we look and we say, hey, I'm down. I know what it's like down here, and you're not alone. Sympathy is, ooh, it's bad, no, you want a sandwich? Empathy is a choice, and it's a vulnerable choice, because in order to connect with you, I have to connect with something in myself that knows that feeling. Rarely, if ever, does an empathic response begin with at least. Yeah. And we do it all the time, because you know what? Someone just shared something with us that's incredibly painful, and we're trying to silver lining it. I don't think that's a verb, but I'm using it as one. We're trying to put the silver lining around it. So I had a miscarriage. Oh, at least you know you can get pregnant. I think my marriage is falling apart. At least you have a marriage. John's getting kicked out of school. At least Sarah is an A student. But one of the things we do sometimes in the face of very difficult conversations is we try to make things better. If I share something with you that's very difficult, I'd rather you say, I don't even know what to say right now. I'm just so glad you told me. Because the truth is, rarely can a response make something better. What makes something better is connection.
Okay, so some wise words there from Brene Brown. I really like the way that that lays out. I think it's so interesting to think about how we don't manage empathy well often. That we often don't seem to manage it all that well. And we move on to a place that's where we're getting into trying to fix rather than just sort of being with the person. And so I think that that's is such an important step to sort of think that through. So one of the things that I want to do as we're talking today is to think about that a little bit, about what's the difference between empathy and sort of not empathy. And so we're going to, so we'll return to that here in just a second. So because oftentimes I think we want to be empathic, and what we find is that we end up doing something that doesn't have the intended response that we want. And so we're thinking that we're meeting the child's emotional need, and yet that's not. Sorry about that. I'll get this sorted out. So we can think that we're meeting the emotional response. We're really not, and it's a misfit somehow with the kids that we're caring for. And so what happens is the emotion just continues and gets bigger. When we're hitting that place of empathy and validation, then what should happen is that we see the emotion quieting. Now, one thing that's around validation is that folks can struggle with is that when we validate the feelings, it can feel like we're condoning the behavior. So particularly if you're in a setting where, let's say in a school or somewhere where there's a big emotion coming out and you're thinking of the effect that this has on everybody around them, and maybe the behavior that goes along with the swearing or whatever else that's happening at the same time, that we're concerned about that. And we're thinking, oh, this doesn't, if I'm validating the feeling, the emotion, then it seems like I'm saying the behavior is okay, and we're not. But we're just choosing to do this in a different order. So the order is important, that we want to help them to manage emotions first, and that will eventually resolve the behavioral issue, like let's say the swearing side of it, in terms of a big outburst that's bothering people around them. Another thing that comes up often is so we get kids with big feelings and they're saying big things. And oftentimes this will come out as a threat. So they threaten that they're going to hurt themselves. I'm going to go throw myself off the bridge. I'm going to go jump into traffic, or I'm going to do something to you. I'm going to burn your house down. I hate you, and I'm going to do this to you. Or I'm going to do this at school. I'm going to bring a knife to school and I'm going to kill everybody. And we get this, so we get these big language coming along with the big feelings. And one of the things I think it's important for us to do is to take the feeling seriously, but not necessarily the issue. So the issue being, I want this, and you're stopping me. Like, we don't need to solve that, but we can take the feeling seriously. We don't need to, the threat, often it's not a real threat, it's just the big feeling that's coming out in big words, and sometimes for effect, right? Trying to get a reaction. And if instead we concentrate on validating the emotions and understanding the feeling, take the feeling seriously and don't worry so much about the words, then we actually get further with the kids. I understand that would be hard to do if you've got a threat that the child's threatening, I'm going to bring a knife to school and I'm going to do this or that. Then we jump into that protective place of, oh no, like that's not okay. And what if they did this? And the vast majority of the time, what children are experiencing is just a big feeling, and they've learned some big scary language, and sometimes it can feel so invasive and so scary. So this is a child in your home that says, I hate you, and when you're asleep tonight, I'm gonna kill your cat. Something like that, that feels just like such an affront and so scary that they would actually do this. The vast majority of the time, they're expressing a big feeling that's coming out as this as this big language, and we don't need to respond to that language. Let's deal with the feeling, and that's going to resolve the threat anyways, even if whatever it was that they were thinking. If we just can validate their emotions and help them be calmer. A term that we really like is from Daniel Siegel, Dr. Daniel Siegel. He uses this term, name it to tame it. And we use this around the idea of emotional language. If we can teach kids language for their feelings, that this actually quiets the emotional part of the brain and allows them, it's almost like when I've got a word for it, that this allows me to understand more what I'm feeling. Instead of just feeling, I don't know what this is. Oh, that's disappointment. Oh, that's feeling like my mom doesn't love me. Oh, that's this other feeling. Once I can label it, it quiets the power, in a sense, of that feeling over us. So in the sense that having a name for it helps to tame it, helps to quiet it down. Another thing that Daniel Siegel talks about is how when emotions firing and you're all having these big feelings, that's happening on the right hemisphere of your brain, so the right side of your brain. When we can attach some language to it, it actually activates the left side of your brain, the language hemisphere of your brain. And that correspondingly quiets down the right-hand side. So not completely, just quiets it down. So being able to attach language quiets down the emotional reactivity. Okay, so we'll come back to the idea of just language in a second, but let's think about what empathy is. Okay, so noticing another person, being curious about their feelings, identifying and helping them to name possible feelings, that we acknowledge their feelings are real, we validate. The strong feelings can be really hard. So we're really listening. We're jumping in without jumping in with opinions or trying to fix it or to make the feeling go away. What empathy's not. Read through this list and see if you have some favorites on here, because I think I did. What are some things on here that you might overhear people saying to kids when they're having a big emotion, or that you yourself might use? These things don't feel like empathy, and so they won't have that effect of helping to quiet the child's emotional reactions down. So in terms of building the child's capacity around these things, we're interested in how we can help them to kind of grow their own emotional language. And so how can we give them language that's developmentally appropriate so that it fits with what developmentally they can understand, and then move from that to where we're able to offer them some sort of skills, right? So some skills of emotional literacy. So let me share a couple of things around this. So if we think about emotional literacy, one part of this is kind of implicit teaching. So this is the structured teaching. This is saying, here are some feelings, and this is here's a way that you can experience them. So this is the chart on the wall that's got the mad, sad, glad, simple kind of language with the faces. And we're trying to teach that emotions are normal, that we all have feelings. There are different curriculums that schools use, mind-up curriculum. The zones of regulation is one we really like for our kids, because often they're quite a ways behind in terms of their ability to identify emotions. And the zones of regulation is a super simple way to kind of mark that. So they're talking almost more about colors. What color are you at now in terms of stress? And then they add in the language around that as well. We also play tons of games with our kids. We encourage the caregivers to do this. The more you can model your own feelings and share that with the kids, the better. So if you're having a bad day, you can say that. We want you to be honest with your feelings in front of the kids. So as we do these things, as we validate their emotions, as we give them some language for what they're feeling, and as all of that care is decreasing their stress response, decreasing their emotional response. And that's the foundation for learning to do it on their own. So we're modeling that feeling language. We're taking opportunities to, let's say you're watching a video with them, stop the video, or watching a sitcom, stop it and say, whoa, I wonder what that person's feeling right now. Like, wow. And so we're trying to get kids to get into the minds of someone else, what they might be feeling, what they might be thinking. That's often a lot easier for them than when you're asking about them directly. So instead of saying, how are you feeling? It's more like, wow, I wonder what that person's feeling. And all of that starts to build up their capacity around understanding emotions. So that's kind of implicit teaching in terms of modeling first. I remember in one of the homes we had the caregivers had put up on the wall. We encouraged them to put up on the wall a feelings chart. And we didn't want one of these charts with 24 different faces and different feelings because it was too complicated. We wanted to start really simple. And so we had, 6 or 8 different feeling states and with an expression. And each person in the house had a magnet with their picture on it. And every time they walked past that chart on the way out the door, the caregiver would stop and say, oh, how am I feeling right now? I think I'm feeling like this. And they'd move their magnet to the face that would describe how they were feeling. And they would encourage the child to do the same thing or the teen to do the same thing. And so there's all of that sort of modeling of this that's really helpful. And then we've got the kind of explicit teaching right now. Now we're doing games around feelings. Now we're using these curriculum that we're talking about. If you want to look this up, this actually might be handy to you in terms of explaining this to kids, is to Dr. Daniel Siegel, who we mentioned before. Look up the hand model of the brain on YouTube. I'd walk you through that, but I think we're a little bit low on time. But it's a really nice way to talk about how when the survival part of your brain fires, or your big emotions fire, it makes the thinking brain go offline. And he talks about flipping your lid, where all of a sudden the thinking brain's not in charge anymore. And that can be a nice explanation for kids about what's happening. And then we can ask them from that, would you like to learn some things that would help your survival brain and your feelings brain not fire so much, so you don't flip your lid and you can stay a little bit more in control? And sort of invites response with that. Okay, let's take a couple minutes for questions here again. Okay, some really interesting questions from caregivers. I'm going to read both of them. So first, I struggle to validate emotion when my foster daughter, age 9, is screaming at my foster son, just 11 months old. Wow. When she's screaming, shut up, I hate you, you're so stupid. I find it so upsetting because it's so hurtful to him. So that's that thing about, it feels like if we're validating that emotion, it feels like we're condoning the behavior. I understand she's feeling jealous or frustrated, and it's not really about him, but he's an easy target. And I don't know how to validate feelings without encouraging this terrible treatment of the baby. So I think all of that, that validation for her feelings needs to come in a time when she's separate from the baby. And those times when you're sort of validating that feeling and trying to guess at what that feeling might be. Chances are, so many of our kids are so longing for adults to care for them that they're super jealous about anyone else and take that away from them. And so think about ways that you can sort of fill her bucket. If you got an 11-month-old, sometimes the little ones are taking so much of her time and attention that the older ones are getting left out. And so the reactions can be coming out of that. So there might be some things that you need to kind of shift in terms of making sure you're filling her bucket, emotional bucket, a little bit more frequently, and then talk about that feeling outside the times when she's getting angry. And then I would really reinforce the times when she's able to be kind and help you to care for the little one. Another one asks about my son's very negative and a lot of his responses. Do you have a way to understand when we need to stop the empathy and move towards truth teaching about what they're expressing? Okay, I struggle with this as I do the 5 steps, but it seems that he gets stuck in negativity and it's overwhelming to know just when to step in. Yeah, what a struggle, eh? So we've got kids with this kind of negative view. Everything's bad, everything's interpreted in such a negative way. And so their experience of the world has all that negativity to it. And they're coming up with stories and it's not true. They've misinterpreted a situation. And how do you sort of step in with empathy there versus that sort of truth piece? I think the one part of the answer is not to confront the exaggerated or overly negative piece and to work on the other side. I, again, come back to our therapeutic bookends. Let's quiet the stress response, deepen the attachment experience, deepen the amount of time that he's feeling empathy and concern from you, and don't try and override that negativity. I think we solve the negativity eventually by pouring in on the positive side rather than on the other side. Along with that, though, there is some evidence that if we can get kids to talk about things that are positive, that it helps to change their perception and their mood. So it might be that a couple of times during the day, you might maybe at dinner time, maybe at bedtime, where you're stopping and saying, wow, what was your favorite thing today? And whether that's just something they had to eat or something else, that focusing for a moment on the favorite thing, on the positive thing over time will help to quiet that, some of that negativity. Really good questions. So, I can tell as we hear these questions, so many of you are in situations where you're struggling with your child right now, and you're struggling to find some answers. We realize that a course like this, we're only able to give you a certain amount, and it's really just the tip of the iceberg kind of thing, right? That we're just sort of touching the surface of these things. These principles are ones that we've found to be helpful over and over and over again. Hundreds of cases around the province, every age, from about 4 years old up to 17, 18 years old, all kinds of different presentations of kids. But we found that these principles, when we go back to them over and over and over, that therapeutic bookends of calming the stress response, providing that deeper attachment, protecting from new attachment injuries, stepping in with positive identity, really focusing on positive identity development. These things we know work, and we so strongly believe in it. We want to figure out ways to get that out to you. Obviously, there's information on our website, which you probably found, and through our mailing list. We've also packaged this in a number of courses that we think would be so helpful to you. This one for caregivers, those of you that are struggling with an adoptive child or your own biological child or someone else in your family's child or foster child, this course is really set up to help to give you practical strategies. We talk about 7 developmental domains that get affected by trauma and how we can respond differently. And we're absolutely convinced that this will make such a difference. And so this particular course is one for you that are caring for kids. We have 3 other courses, and I'll just take a minute to share those with you, or 2 other courses actually. All right, just taking a second here. If I can do this a little bit differently. So the other courses that we have are connected to, that are sort of packaged a little bit differently. So one is for schools. So for teachers, how do you apply this information within a school setting? So how can we take that information and apply it within a school setting? So we have 3 courses, as I mentioned, the giving and receiving healing for kids who've got that trauma background, really for parents, caregivers, on the day-to-day things that you can be doing differently with your kids that should help them to grow and to start to thrive. We've got the trauma-focused schools course. So how do we apply this in an educational setting? And then from that, how do we give parents something as teachers, as a school? How can you help to equip your parents more to work with these children? And the last one is around a trauma-focused residential caregiving. Many of the children that we end up working with are from staffed homes. And so they're in a home where there's rotating paid caregivers. And so their principles are a little bit different there. This actually, if you're just interested in the overall model that we use, the complex care and intervention model, or the way that we package all of this information in terms of thinking it through, giving us a framework for how we understand the presentations of kids and what we then do about it. The trauma-focused residential caregiving course is also a really good sort of primer for that as well. Yeah, so because we're because we want to try and get these ideas spread around as best we can. These webinars will be helpful with that, we hope, and but also these courses, we feel like this gives us an opportunity to help to spread this information, these ideas, and these practical strategies, to many people that we wouldn't be able to reach otherwise. A nice thing about the courses is that it's also possible for you to join to join a closed Facebook group that would be just for you, whether you're a caregiver, whether you're a person working in the schools, where staff from our team moderate that and try and bring answer questions and to add information for you to kind of enrich your learning experience. So because of the through this webinar. We're really pleased that you've joined this, and we want to offer a discount. This is available until the end of this week, so just 4 days. But if you use the coupon code webinar20, so go onto our website. This is we're on our complex trauma resources website here. Scroll down to look at those 3 courses. You can open it up and see what the course looks like, a little bit more information about it. And then if you decide that it is something you'd like to participate in, then what you can do is at the sign-in and enrollment place at the bottom, you can use the coupon code, discount code webinar20. And then the course is available 24/7. You take it at your own pace, and you're able to learn this information and think about how to apply it more in your setting. So thanks so much again for joining today. I really appreciate it. I'm so much looking forward to seeing in the chat where you're all from. I know some of you will be brand new to us. I'm excited to see that. Some of you will be old friends that have been around us for a while, and I'm really glad that you're here as well. So thanks so much. Oh, I've one more thing to mention. So next month, we're going to have Angela Murphy, who is a school psychologist and a member of our team. She's going to be talking about how to use these principles in a school setting. And then we're going to come back with myself and to talk more about attachment and to talk more about identity as different months go on. So we'll be with you every month. And thanks again for joining so much today.